Franklin Roosevelt has been called inscrutable, and you make mention of this, of course, in your fine one-volume biography. Based on your research, who among his colleagues and intimates really pierced that armor and got to know him, you think?
I can't say that any individual got to know Roosevelt especially well. I think everybody in close contact with Roosevelt knew a piece of Roosevelt. And I took it as the historian's task to add up the different pieces to get this coherent whole, this whole picture of Roosevelt. But it was part of Roosevelt's temperament and part of his deliberate style to give only parts of himself to individuals. So Eleanor Roosevelt knew a side of Franklin Roosevelt that other people didn't. But there were other parts of his personality, other parts of his motivation that I'm convinced she hardly had a clue about, even though she lived with him for 4 years. His children understood aspects of Roosevelt's temperament and personality, but their view was limited, as all children's view of their parents is limited. They know something about him. They know certainly what kind of father he was, but I don't think they knew what kind of husband he was, and they didn't have the best view as to what kind of president he was. Various people who worked for Roosevelt, Harry Hopkins. If Harry Hopkins had lived to write a memoir, he would have had some very interesting things to say. Now, Robert Sherwood's book, Roosevelt and Hopkins, is the next best thing because there's a whole lot of Hopkins in there. But it's Hopkins sort of in real time. Hopkins writing memos, or Hopkins in some cases talking about Roosevelt to Sherwood. But it's not Hopkins stepping back and with the advantage of hindsight saying, this is what I came to know. Raymond Moley. Raymond Moley was a great Roosevelt enthusiast at the beginning. He later had fundamental disagreements with Roosevelt. He remained charmed and intrigued by the personality, even as he was put off by some of the policies. So the answer to your question is, there was no single person who really understood Franklin Roosevelt. But if you add up the bits that all the different people around him knew, you have a better chance of getting at Roosevelt. And one of the things about people who worked with Franklin Roosevelt was they all wrote memoirs. Francis Perkins has one of the most insightful memoirs on Roosevelt in the White House. But of course, that's just one part of it. You started off by saying lots of people have called Roosevelt inscrutable. Well, even after studying him, write about him. Yeah, there are times when he seems pretty inscrutable to me.
Of all of the debates that swirl around FDR, domestically, foreign policy, whether you're talking about the New Deal or Pearl Harbor or what he knew and when he knew it with regard to Churchill, all the debates, what do you think is still the most fascinating historiographic debate to grapple with?
Well, the one that claims the most time and space on the internet is the conspiracy theory regarding Pearl Harbor. That one just won't go away. And this despite the fact that I think I've adduced in the book, strong positive evidence that he did not know, that he could not have known. And usually when you're dealing with conspiracy theories, the best you can come up with is negative evidence. There's no evidence of conspiracy, therefore. But of course that carries no weight with conspiratorials. But in the case of Pearl Harbor, I think there's very strong evidence, and the strong evidence is precisely this. Roosevelt was Assistant Navy Secretary in the decade of the First World War. And this was precisely the time when the United States was building up its battleship fleet. Roosevelt personally laid the keel, ceremonially laid the keel for the USS Arizona. And he was responsible for the construction of the heart of America's battleship fleet. So that on the morning of December 7th, 1941, those 8 battleships that were in Pearl Harbor, those were in an emotional, almost literal sense, those were Roosevelt's babies. Roosevelt felt this personal connection to those ships because he was the one who ensured that they would be constructed. Roosevelt was a fan of the Navy from the time he entered office. The time he entered office as Assistant Navy Secretary. If Roosevelt had known that an attack was coming on Pearl Harbor, most definitely would have sent an order to get those battleships out of the harbor, send them out on patrol, send them out on maneuvers, get them away. If Roosevelt had known, and if he had wanted the cause for war, the casus belli, he could have left a couple of old age destroyers. He could have left just any kinds of ships in there. If he wanted the Japanese attack, now frankly that would have been carrying things too far either. At the very least, he would have told the American defenders, get ready, there's an attack coming. The fact that those battleships were still there indicates to me quite positively that he did not know that an attack was coming at Pearl Harbor. Now, of course, he knew that an attack was coming somewhere, but he, like everybody else who was in the know, expected the attack would come in Southeast Asia somewhere, conceivably on the Philippines. But Pearl Harbor, that was just beyond the imagination.
What do you think Roosevelt was like to work with day in and day out? If you were fairly close high advisor to him, you've wrote some very interesting things about his way of dealing with people. What was he like?
He would have been a comfortable person to work for in terms of he was always friendly. He rarely was upset. He didn't get angry. He didn't take out his frustrations on the people who worked for him. So in that respect, he would have been an easy boss. If you were somebody, though, who needed a decision from Roosevelt, if you were somebody who wanted to know, okay, Mr. President, what are we going to do? He could, and I know he was, very frustrated to some of the people who worked for him, because he was a believer that a lot of decisions simply don't have to be made. And if you make them prematurely, you will have wasted political capital. Because things that look like crises maybe aren't really crises yet. And if you just wait, they will work themselves out without the need for a presidential decision. But other decisions do have to be made, and Roosevelt wasn't very good at making them, or at once having made them, sticking to them. The biggest decision, and the one that caused the greatest angst among Roosevelt's advisors during the Second World War, was the whole question of where's the second front going to be? And Roosevelt's military advisors, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and others, wanted Roosevelt to make a decision in favor of an early invasion of Western Europe, an invasion of France, because they believed that the only way to fight the Nazis is to fight the Nazis and to go right at them. And they thought they had Roosevelt's decision in favor of this early invasion. But every time they thought they had a decision, Winston Churchill would come to Washington and explain why the invasion of France would have to be put off, why the attack should come first in North Africa and then in Italy, and how the Mediterranean was so essential. So Roosevelt's advisors just groaned every time they heard that Churchill was coming, because they were pretty sure that a decision that they thought the president had made was about to be unmade. And Stimson and Marshall, they tore their hair at having to deal with Roosevelt. They would have much preferred a president who would say, this is what we're going to do, and now go ahead and do it. From that perspective, working for Franklin Roosevelt could have been very difficult. Now, Roosevelt had a particular insight and a broader perspective than they did. And Roosevelt understood that any invasion of France was going to have to take place from Britain. And it was going to require the participation, the enthusiastic participation of the British. And if even if Winston Churchill could have been cajoled into saying, okay, we're going to do it now, without Churchill's enthusiastic support, then the invasion would have stood a much slimmer chance of success. So Roosevelt understood the politics of this decision better than the people who worked for him did. But nonetheless, it was exceedingly frustrating at times to be one of Roosevelt's subordinates.